The salt marshes of the Thorn Coast are not a place for the living. They are a place for the between, the tide-washed boundary where fresh water meets salt, where the land is neither earth nor sea, and where the dead have learned to walk by following the scent of tears. Solenne Marr knew this better than most. She had been a salt forger for 23 years, and in that time she had marked 711 souls with the false salt bloom that let them pass through the tide gates. She had carved new identities into the bones of fugitives, debt dodgers, oath breakers, and one child who had accidentally killed a tide priest's son and needed to become someone else before the dawn tide. The salt bloom was her trade, a thin crust of crystallized sea spray, applied to the skin with a formula known only to the Forgery Guild of the Thorn Coast. It made the tide gates read you as someone else. It let you pass through the veil of salt that separated the coastal kingdoms from the Deepwater Reaches beyond. It bought you a new life, provided the price was paid in advance, and the price was always the same. A year of your memories, extracted through the palm of your hand and stored in a salt jar that Solenne kept locked in the iron chest beneath her shack. The salt remembered everything, and one day, Solenne knew, the salt would ask for them back. She had been holding the jar for 3 hours. It was labeled Orenvel, 14th of Deepwater Tide, 12 years taken. Orenvel had been her most recent client, a fisherman from the Salt Strand villages who had stolen from the Tide Church and needed to disappear into the Deepwater Reaches before the Inquisitors found him. He had been terrified. She could taste it in the memories she pulled from his palm. The taste of brine and fear, like drinking seawater on an empty stomach. She had marked him, sent him through the tide gate at midnight with a new name and a new face, as far as the salt bloom could provide one. He had walked into the fog and disappeared. That was 6 days ago. And now the jar was glowing. Solenne knew what a glowing jar meant. The Forgery Guild had taught her 23 years ago that a memory jar glowed when its owner died. The salt released everything at once. Every stolen memory, every image, every whispered secret, trying to find its way home. If she broke the seal, the memories would pour into her like a flood. If she left it sealed, the jar would crack within a week, and the salt marsh would absorb them all. She had never broken a seal. It was the first rule of the guild. Never take back what was given. But Orenvel's jar was glowing brighter by the hour, and she could feel something moving inside it, something that had not been there when she sealed it. She walked to the tide gate with Orenvel's jar in her coat pocket. The fog was thick enough to drink. The marsh crickets had gone silent. Even the gulls, always screaming, always hungry, had retreated inland, which meant something was coming through the gate that the birds recognized before humans could. The tide priest did not acknowledge her. He stood before the arch with his arms raised, reed hood dripping, whispering the counting prayer that kept the gate stable. The salt curtain shimmered and hissed. Behind it, Solenne could see shapes moving, silhouettes of towers and bridges, of figures walking on streets that did not exist in this world. She had never stepped through the tide gate. In 23 years, she had never needed to. The Thorn Coast was her home. The salt marsh was her sanctuary. The Deepwater Reaches were a myth she sold to desperate people, a promised land she had no proof existed. But she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had handled 700 stolen memories, that the shape on the other side of the gate was Orenvel. He was waiting for her. His face was the same face she had given him, the salt bloom had held. But his eyes were wrong. They were the color of old seawater. And he was not alone. Behind him, the spectral city had gathered its dead. They had pulled her through the gate before she could scream. One moment she was standing in the marsh, the salt curtain shimmering before her. The next, the water had risen to her ankles, the torchlight had turned pale blue, and she was standing in a hall that existed beneath the marsh in a way she could not explain. The salt crystal walls held voices. She could hear them whispering. The Tide King's name was Valen the Salt-Souled, and he had ruled the Deepwater Reaches for longer than the Thorn Coast had been called by that name. When the tide gates were first built, not by human hands, but by something older, Valen had been the one to accept the first bargain. He had traded his kingdom's memories for safety. Every year his people gave their most precious memories to the salt. In exchange, the tide did not rise to drown them, but the bargain had a cost Valen had not understood. The salt that held their memories was the same salt that held their souls. When a man died in the Deepwater Reaches, his memories did not fade. They crystallized, trapped in the salt forever, unable to pass beyond. The dead did not leave. They accumulated, they grew in number, and they grew in hunger. Orenvel was one of them now. Solenne could see the salt bloom on his skin had turned from white to gray, the mark of a memory that had been claimed by the deep. He had died in the Reaches, and his stolen identity had been absorbed into the Council's collective memory. And now the Council had a question for her. They wanted her to take back every memory she had ever stored. 711 jars. 711 stolen lives. The Council of the Drowned believed that if she consumed all of them, if she let the salt flood pour through her, she would become the gatekeeper. She would hold the memories of the Deepwater Reaches inside her own skull. She would know every soul that had ever passed through the tide gate, and then she would be able to close it. She did not do it. She stood in the cathedral of salt with the jar in her hands, and she listened to the whispers of 700 voices, and she remembered the face of every person who had given her their memories. The fisherman who had wept when he handed over the memory of his daughter's first word. The woman who had surrendered the image of a garden she would never see again. The child, the one who had killed the tide priest's son, who had given her the memory of his mother's hands. And she understood, standing there in the briny shallows with the dead pressing close, that the salt did not want to keep those memories. The salt was a prison. The Council of the Drowned had been trapped for centuries, unable to move on because their memories had been taken from them. Not given, but stolen, and stored in a substance that would not decay. She broke the jar. She did not consume the memories, she released them. The salt crystal cracked in her hands, and the blue light escaped like breath, rising through the water, through the cathedral roof, through the marsh above. The Council screamed, a sound like the tide pulling back from 1,000 shores at once, and then they were gone, not dead, free. The tide gate collapsed behind her as she crawled out of the marsh at dawn. The salt curtain shattered into a cloud of brine that hung in the air for a full minute before dissipating into the morning mist. The Deepwater Reaches were closed. No one would pass through again. Solenne Marr sits on the porch of her shack now, watching the sun rise over the marsh for the first time in 23 years. She has not slept. She has not eaten. She has done nothing but listen to the silence where 700 voices used to whisper. The salt jars are all cracked. The memories are gone. And the marsh, for the first time in 1,000 years, belongs only to the living. In the distance, a fishing boat puts out from the village. A child laughs somewhere among the reeds. The tide rises, and the salt marsh accepts it without a whisper of complaint. The gate is closed, the deep is sealed, and the Saltborne oath, a promise made by a dead king to a hungry sea, has finally been broken. But Solenne knows the silence will not last forever. The salt remembers everything, and somewhere beneath the marsh, in the crystal depths where the light does not reach, new memories are already beginning to form.